Hello and good afternoon, everyone. Equinile is a nonprofit organization that aims to build and inculcate environmental awareness. And this dissemination of information is tackled through sessions and seminars and webinars and courses and workshops and conferences. And through the aforementioned means, we encourage discourse and interactions between our audiences and between our experts likewise. And today we're very happy to welcome our expert speaker, Dr. Oliver Springste-Baginski. And our topic will be green water and river basin health. Dr. Oliver is an associate professor in the University of East Anglia. He has a PhD in geography from SOAS University of London and a Master's of Arts and Economic History from London University of Economics and Political Science. Dr. Oliver, we're very happy to have you. I'll refer the mic to you right now. Welcome.
Okay, thanks very much for the introduction. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you very fine.
Okay. Excellent. Okay. Well, thanks so much for the invitation. It's a privilege to be invited to talk, and I feel like it's a nice opportunity. You know, it's an honor to share what I'm doing, my modest activities, but I hope that what I have to say may be useful to your audience. And I also hope that we can have a sort of longer term relationship, which could help me to understand what would be more useful. And maybe we can have an exchange. Also, I'd like to learn more about your work and your situation. So I've been working for about 30 years in community-based resource management, and I've spent most of that time in Asia, particularly India and Nepal and Burma. And my starting point for my concern was learning what a mess the British made of supporting communities for forest management. And the British, you know, my government wanted to extract resources and degraded community tenure, in particular around forest and water resources, and they did that around the world. And I think the pattern that they developed in Burma and India, then they exported subsequently. So that's a problem, and I felt like it's a slight duty of conscientious people to try and remedy some of the problems that their countries caused. So I got involved at the start of my career in working particularly in India, Western Himalayas, in forest governance. And I've been working with colleagues there for decades. And there was a major reform, which I was partly involved in 2006, a legal reform of forest rights. So the indigenous communities, and there's over 100 million indigenous communities in India in particular, were able to secure rights for forest. I guess that's my background, but I've come in the last decade or so, I've been working on many different sectors, and I've started to work on rivers and climate impacts and climate mitigation. So I suggested I would talk today a bit about green water. I want to slightly adjust the focus, but I will talk about green water. When we say green water, we mean the moisture in the landscape, not the rivers, but the moisture in the landscape from rainfall that permeates the soil and in ecosystems. And that's increasingly important because with climate change, we're seeing more rainfall, but it's coming in more intense bursts. So we see more extreme weather events. We can see more flooding and more drought. So there's a strong imperative globally to promote soil carbon and and protect forests in order to reduce the speed with which precipitation reaches what we could call blue water, you know, rivers and lakes. Okay, so that's a bit of backstory, but I don't want to spend too much time on backstory. Why don't I talk, and as I go, maybe we can, if anyone has any questions, let me know. So I'm going to try and share my screen now, if I can. And that will be the screen I'm going to show, PowerPoint slide. Okay, can you just confirm you can see that okay? Is that okay? We can see? You are screen sharing. Okay, good. So I slightly adjust the title. Forgive me, but you know, academics, we don't like to do the be too predictable. So I'm going to talk a bit about climate change, and in the context of green water, how can we promote livelihood resilience of communities? So we know that temperatures are going up. It's being driven by particularly fossil fuel emission, and that's causing all sorts of negative impacts. There are a few positive impacts, but not very many. Mainly, it's had negative impact, like this example of flooding. This is in Myanmar, in Burma, and I will talk about case studies in India and Burma later. So because of climate change, we need to adjust our plan for development, our ideas for national, village level and global development towards climate resilient development. We have to emit less greenhouse gases. That means using less fossil fuel, zero fossil fuel as soon as possible. We have to reduce poverty. That's important if we are compassionate humans. And we must adapt to the reality of more floods and more droughts and more extreme weather and various other factors. So that's what we increasingly consider the pathway of climate resilient development. The Sustainable Development Goals, number 13, says that climate change is the single biggest threat to development. So for a long time, people were saying, let's not worry about climate change before we alleviate poverty, before we get economic growth. Increasingly, we have to recognize that even if we are concerned to reduce poverty and we are concerned to, to grow the economy, we must do it in a way which is reducing the impacts of climate change, mitigating by not emitting, and adapting to the fact of life of the fact that the climate has changed, is going to get worse, significantly worse. So if we look at the latest International Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC summary for policymakers, they have this very helpful chart. It's ever so complicated, but let's try and simplify. So our present development status globally is somewhere between not very good and excellent. With climate change, our status is definitely going to deteriorate. We can expect more global warming and many more problems for livelihoods. We need to do something about that. So we need to have this sort of actions, more understanding, more improved inclusive governance at all scales, particularly local scale, and more equity. So that would hopefully lead to climate resilient development that would reduce poverty and improve well-being. If we don't do that, we will have a declining situation of more inequality, more environmental degradation, and significantly lower development outcomes. So this is like a global mandate, but that implies that every country, we need to work together, village level, district, intermediate, national, international level, to improve the outcomes for communities. That sounds very abstract. You know, this is a very abstract chart, but in practice, it means civil society like Eco-Nile and universities working together and pressurizing and working with the good members of government and with good individuals in villages and in towns to build alliances towards a better pathway. If we had have acted earlier, we'd be doing better now. We didn't act early, we didn't act enough, it didn't act quickly enough. And one of the things is closing down fossil fuels. It sounds drastic, but there's no other way around it. We have to stop using fossil fuel. And we have to make sure that the impacts don't harm the people who are less responsible. You know, rich people emit the most petrochemical greenhouse gases, and poor people tend to suffer the consequence. All right, so that's a quite important concept. So I'm going to talk about the problem, just the background to that climate change, we can do quickly, and then what sort of interventions can we think about? So particularly, how can we help villages to adapt to climate change? And the green water is one element here, which I'll come on to. So we see this sort of problems all around the world, and they're getting a lot worse. They're not getting so much worse in Northern Europe and the US, because we've got money, we've got resources, we've got, you know, systems that are fairly functional to protect us, and the temperatures haven't gone up so extremely. But when I work in India, Burma, Nepal, you see lots of very extreme events happening with increasing frequency. Storms, particularly coastal cyclones, in which thousands of people are killed and many more people are displaced, and families are split up and livelihood assets are destroyed and crops are destroyed. Floods, particularly in the lowlands, becoming more frequent, more extreme. Landslides when it rains too much, thin soils, you tend to get infiltration at the top of the ridge, large areas of soil are washed over, so losing agricultural land and destroying villages below. And then these very exceptional events where, for example, this is in Shan in northeast Myanmar, where very large hailstones destroy people's houses and can injure or kill people if they're caught out. So that's completely unprecedented event. So that's becoming normal occurrences, and people are having to, people are losing assets, and they're having to start to adapt to these. You know, how do you adapt to floods that destroy your crops? You move to town, you get out of the way, you move your house, you buy lower quality land further away. So it's reducing people's incomes and it's using up savings. I'm sure you're all aware of this unprecedented event in Pakistan this year, where large areas of the centre of the country were inundated, crops were lost, livelihoods were lost, livestock. It's catastrophic for that, for those areas, and it's very expensive. You know, it's very destructive and it's difficult to come back from. And it's that last time that happened, not as bad, but in 2010 there was a flood. You could say the lessons weren't learned, or however, whatever they learned, there wasn't enough money, and there wasn't enough. However much money you have, you can't really protect against these unexpected melting of glaciers, extreme rains early on. So although there were early warning systems, you know, it was difficult to defend. Then there can be more subtle effects, like farmers in the hills who are relying on shifting cultivation are telling us they can't burn the slash. They cut the slash to cultivate. This can be a very sustainable system. If it's not expanding, then you have agroforestry rotational cultivation. It's very sustainable as long as people can cut the slash and burn it. But when it rains early on, the slash is too moist and it won't burn off. So it's affecting cropping systems. In some lowland areas, the flooding is leaving silt. Where people cultivate rice, they have 0.5 metre of silt, which is permeable, so they can't cultivate. So they have to spend money clearing the silt, which is expensive. People are being displaced from their villages by landslides, and the process of relocation makes a huge difference to their subsequent livelihoods. If they're relocated to places which have few opportunities, like the case here, they really suffer from a deterioration in quality of life, and these people are very depressed. So the process of relocation after landslides is critical. But that's all happening in a wider context of what we would call agrarian transition, people participating more and more in the economy, moving to urban areas and facing increasing competition for land, water, maybe subsoil mining like coal, other minerals. And also in the context of conflicts. So we see fluctuating conflict around the world in many countries. And we've also seen this COVID crisis. So whatever we try and do to face climate change, it's in the context of all sorts of other changes which are very unpredictable, and which the problems can be compounded by climate change. So just to summarize the basic points about climate change is being driven by emissions, primarily of fossil fuel gases, carbon dioxide, also nitrous oxide and methane. Methane is not so much from fossil fuel as from livestock and land use change, and a little from waste. But fossil fuel is the major problem, and this is emissions of fossil fuel industry emissions. And you can see There wasn't very much before 1950. So in the last 70 years, emissions have accelerated mainly through extraction of coal, oil and gas. Until about 1980, that was mainly Europe and Russia and the US. And then since 1980, 1990, it's been driven by China, expansion in China and Asia, not very much in Africa. There's a strange noise on the microphone. I don't know whether that's interference or some distraction. Okay, so this is driving climate change. And okay, there's a breakdown of the different sources, so mainly fossil fuels, also direct emissions from agriculture and land use change. And those emissions are forcing the temperature to increase, and we are in now 2021, 2022, so we're about here, and there are several different scenarios of what will happen with the global climate, depending on how quickly we cut emissions. So we need to cut emissions immediately to zero. That means not using fossil fuels. And that's almost impossible to do. So we know that in the best estimates, the reduction in fossil fuel use will happen slowly. What drives climate change is the emissions, which once they go up into the atmosphere, they stay in the atmosphere for about 100 years. So we could say the area under the curve is what is going to cause the momentum of continuing climate change, even when we stop using fossil fuel. So this area under the curve is one of the most optimistic scenarios for cutting emissions. This is emission from fossil fuel. So if we cut emissions quickly, we will only have that amount of emissions in the atmosphere. If we cut emissions slowly or even increase emissions, because at the moment emissions are still increasing, then we will have a much bigger problem, and that will drive climate change up to 5%. So we have different scenarios depending on how quickly we cut. Emissions have been increasing. They decreased quickly under COVID, but they've bounced back and increased again. So we need to cut them immediately. Now, no one is really expecting cuts. Actually, although that's what we need, I don't expect emissions to cut. I expect that whatever are the worst expectations, they are the most realistic, because many countries, many economies rely centrally on fossil fuels. So although we might dream, let's just cut immediately, it's almost impossible to transfer to a zero emission industrialization model. So if we don't cut, we will have absolute catastrophe. We will have more extreme weather events, we'll have higher temperatures getting worse, we'll have glacial melt, ocean acidification, sea level rise. We can try and improve resilience to those by drought farming, by adjusting irrigation systems, etc. But to be realistic, that is like a medium-term measure, and the longer-term measure is, how do we cope with extreme changes? So that is a view of the Ganges basin in India. That is the Ganges, that's the Brahmaputra. That river Brahmaputra starts here. So I'm just showing, there's an illustration of the Ganges Brahmaputra basin. And across this landscape, climate change is already having various effects in different areas. So in the Tibetan Plateau, we're seeing unusual rainfall patterns, warming, and the higher altitude, the quicker the warming. In the middle hills, we're seeing more extreme weather events, more landslide. In the arid areas, we're seeing increased aridity, heavy rainfall, which is leading to soil erosion, already very thin soils. In the lowlands, we are seeing flooding, groundwater depletion, fluctuating yields, more irregular rains. And then in the coastal areas, we're seeing more storms, decreasing catches, depleted fishery, more ocean acidification, which is happening very slowly. So the impacts are different in different areas. And I'd be very interested to hear from friends today what is happening in different areas of Sudan. What are the current practices to cope with those changes? One issue is land use change. So part of climate change is driven by fossil fuel emission, and part is driven by clearance of carbon-rich soils. So particularly across forest areas, Amazon, Congo, and Southeast Asian basins, and a little in Southeast Asia, a little in Central Americas. So it's important that those forests aren't cleared. So many international agricultural commodities like palm oil, like soya, and like beef, trade in international beef, these are driving land use change. So we also have to be careful not to participate in international commodity chains which are driving climate change. So because of those emissions, mainly fossil fuel, also forestry and intensification of agriculture, loss of soil carbon, we're seeing increased greenhouse gases, and that drives increased temperatures. And you can see 80s, 90s, 2000, 2020, there's a shocking trend in increased global temperatures, and that's different in different areas of the world. So particularly in Northern Europe and Siberia, across Moscow Empire, you can see very rapidly increasing temperatures. But other parts like West Africa, North Africa, the east of the Amazon basin, we're also seeing exceptionally high heating, and those patterns will become more unpredictable as temperatures increase. So it's very difficult to guess what will happen. There are modelers that speculate what will happen to rain for extreme weather events, but it's hard to be sure because the system is so complex. That will feed through to livelihood changes. It's already feeding through, and it will increase depending on how much temperature increase. So changes in food, water, ecosystem, and more extreme weather events. And we already see a trend in more floods, in more storms, and in more drought. The quickest increase is in flooding, which is driven by more intense rainfall events in the context of deforestation and degraded river basin, less river health, and less, you could say the green water issue here is keeping the water in the landscape before it gets to the river. If there's an intense rainfall event, the quicker the water gets to the river, the more likely to have a flood. Those floods can also be driven by glacial melt and other factors. But there's a lot of concern that global food security is being affected by that increased flooding, as mentioned in the IPCC reports. And at the same time, we can expect with temperature increases, there'll be a decline in crop yields from particularly wheat and maize, and in some ways in rice. So that decline in crop yields is going to affect different countries in different ways, but it's particularly a problem in northern India and Myanmar and some other parts of the world, in Central Africa, North Africa. And there are lots of other complex effects, how climate change is going to affect food security. Okay, I'm just going to whiz through those. Don't want to go on to. Okay, so there are sort of linear trends which we can already experience, and they're getting worse. And then there are non-linear trends, what's been called tipping points. As temperature goes up, we have feedback loops in particularly melting of the polar glaciers and the glaciers in the Himalayas, the so-called cryosphere, which is irreversible in the very long term. So that will lead to sea level rise and changes in the global circulation. Global ocean circulation keeps the temperature lower around the equator. So if those circulations slow down or stop, it will become hotter around the equator, which is going to be a serious problem. And then many ecosystems like boreal forests and Amazonian forests and Congo Basin will start to dry out and change from being sinks sequestering atmospheric carbon to sources of atmospheric carbon, putting more carbon into the atmosphere, accelerating climate change. So this is quite depressing, and that's what many experts are worried about. We really don't want to push the climate system so far out of the normal state that we get accelerating climate change. And many of my colleagues here at UEA work in the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change, which is the Britain's sort of leading and one of the international leading centres of climate change. And they say this is the most worrying aspect, that if we push the climate system too far, we will have non-linear acceleration of climate change. Okay, so we've got a development process which is leading to more emissions, which is driving climate change, which is impacting communities. And we need to change that development model towards one which mitigates climate change. We stop emitting and also we adapt to the existing climate change successfully. So, I mean, if I had an hour or more, we could talk in the detail about how we understand risk and we mitigate risk. I'll talk a bit about adaptation. Maybe I just whiz through discussion of risk. There's lots of different jargon, but that's probably another lecture. What is most important, I think, for the immediate is we understand how challenging it is to support communities, because communities are doing already what we could call autonomous adaptation. They're already trying to adjust to the changes. And I think it's the responsibility of civil society and academics and government to support communities in the immediate short term, but also in longer term to adapt to climate change. So there are probably 4 areas. The capacity for support for academic, for civil society, for government, understanding and addressing what is driving communities' vulnerability to those shocks, trying to reduce the impacts, the risks, the hazards, and then supporting communities to improve livelihood resilience. There's a lot of jargon. I'm going to skip the jargon because I tried to make it simple. So improving understanding, knowledge, building understanding of what are the risks and what are the impacts, reducing poverty, extreme poverty in particular. Communities where there's severe poverty are much more vulnerable to climate change. Developing infrastructure to reduce the threats, maybe like coastal protection, riverbank protection, managing floods, maybe drainage of floods more effectively, and then building more resilient livelihood and also more resilient ecosystems. So, for instance, tree planting, soil carbon. The point about green carbon is, green water is having landscapes that can retain moisture, trying to redress aridification and desertification by promoting soil carbon on farm trees and so on. Okay, so I'm just going to skip through that. So we can see in the Ganges, where I've been talking and where I've been working for decades, you see that there's a pattern of increased and more erratic rainfall. The agriculture depends on rainfall, but farming practices have adapted to much more predictable monsoon systems. So with erratic rainfall, it becomes more difficult to produce the same amounts. People are also pumping groundwater and relying on off-season flows from glaciers. 80% of rainfall comes between June and October. Although the rainfall has not increased or decreased, we see less low rainfall days and much more heavy rainfall days, which can mean more soil erosion and more downstream flooding. People are responding by pumping more groundwater, but groundwater levels are then declining more quickly. People are also using more synthetic fertilizer, burning agricultural residues rather than grazing it. And that leads to more climate change. It's driving climate change through the use of synthetic fertilizers, which emit nitrogen to the atmosphere. And soil carbon is becoming atmospheric carbon, and also lower air quality. So those practices, pumping groundwater and burning off agricultural residues in particular, are making the system less resilient to climate change. So one of the encouraging responses is to modify agricultural practices, and there's an institute called the Climate Change, Agriculture and Food Security Challenge Fund, which is one of the consultative groups on international agricultural research. Now, I don't know if they're working in Sudan, but it would be nice to try and initiate some collaboration, because they tend to be very good at exploring responses to climate change that can be good for rural communities. So promoting productivity that is adapting to climate change and to some extent mitigating emissions. So the sorts of things is reducing synthetic fertilizer use, which is increasingly expensive and is driving climate change, and it degrades soils. Promoting on-farm composting, on-farm nutrient cycling, promoting soil carbon by composting, by managing agricultural residues, promoting the biology of the soil in various ways, but not killing the soil biology by synthetic fertilizer and chemical use. Promoting on-farm trees like hedgerows, agroforestry systems. Promoting more, I'm just completing, I don't know if someone's counting the time. Okay, so more resilient crop varieties, particularly traditional varieties, and increasingly we see in Europe, we use populations of different land races in the same crop, which can strengthen resilience, because if we get a pest, some varieties will be more resilient to the pest than others. Then managing water irrigation more carefully. So this is like a list of things that can be done at the farming system level to improve resilience. Engaging with markets, selling crops, but not engaging completely. So people may be able to withdraw, not depending on food security of the household on market income. So partial market engagement to spread risk. So these are the sorts of things that need to be explored, but in every household and every farming system, the sorts of things that are appropriate are different. So we need like farmer-led research programs and adaptation initiatives to identify what is most appropriate in different niches. So I just want to talk a bit about the case of Chin in Western Myanmar. It's an area I've been working for about 10 years on development and on rural resource use. So Chin Hills is this area up here. This is the poorest part of Myanmar. It's like ethnic group. And my experience has been that most of the discussion at the international and the national level even is very abstract, and it doesn't make much sense to people. They want to know what they can do, you know, what they should be doing, what is relevant for their reality. So I think in order to translate that international imperative, we've got to be more resilient. We first have to understand what are the current challenges that people are facing in order that we can help them to adapt. We may not have anything to offer them unless we understand their situation. Then we can maybe transfer learning from elsewhere or co-learn with them, right? So most livelihoods are changing very rapidly in lots of different ways, and formal planning can be far too slow. So let's just come back to this Chin example I started to talk about at the beginning. So this is the poorest part of Myanmar, and many communities in Myanmar, with road building, people have moved part of their family or even the whole family down to the plains where there's more productive land, and then they may continue having a farm in the hills. So you see this pattern of urbanization and increasing incorporation into markets, and children then going to school, benefiting from service provision like health provision. But we see also climate change, so increasing rains, more extreme weather. Also upstream in the river basin, we see deforestation and soil erosion. So the overall effect is that livelihoods are becoming more diversified and more complex, and climate change is stressing the livelihood in particular ways. So this is a photo. I was traveling in Chin, and there's new roads, but they're already sliding away in the rain. So people have adapted livelihoods by selling vegetables grown uphill. They will sell it downstream and in the lowland, and then buy rice rather than growing rice. So they have niche crops which are more valuable, and then they can buy rice, which is easier to grow, high yield in the lowland. So it's like a specialization, but it depends on the roads working. So when the roads fail, it makes it very difficult for the upland. Okay, so this is an example I want to talk about of relocation. One of the consequences in 2015 of very heavy rains was that many villages were washed away. Now, some people were killed, but in general, people didn't die, but they lost farmland and housing. So they had to be relocated. And there's three options. Own relocation, so typically local relocation, communities rebuilding, maybe buying land from neighbour or being given land or building on the common land. That is usually the best if they still have farmland locally, because they can manage the process themselves and they can usually arrive at something which is satisfactory. You know, it's not as good, it's never as good, but it may work out okay. And in some cases actually is as good or better, because they may move to a place by the road. They may get special permission. And when they're by the road, it means they're closer to markets, which they like, you know, which they favour. The worst alternative is the government does it, and the government typically does it really badly. So the top photo is a really depressed, relocated village in Tedim town. And those people were miserable because they'd lost nice land and nice homes, and they were dumped in a rubbish place with low water, very little firewood, and very little working opportunity. Somewhere in between is the bottom example, where the whole village lost all its agricultural land. They had to move, but they had a very successful negotiation with the government, and they found very nice land near a local town. So, okay, what's the point of that story is that the process of relocation is really critical for adapting to the impact of climate change. And there's obviously going to be a lot more of these climate refugees in the future. So having relocation processes that work for the communities and fulfill the community aspiration makes a big difference. Siltation, flooding and siltation of paddy land. How to manage that? It's very difficult to manage because we're talking about large amounts of water, and they're bringing silt, which you would think would be an advantage. It's not an advantage for rice cultivation because the silt is permeable. So people want to get rid of most of the silt immediately. So NGOs have started buying these diggers to clear land quickly to help people, maybe a low cost service. Okay, and then the last point I want to make here is that there's been an increased market orientation in the hills with the road building, but with a landslide, people are facing inability to sell to the market. So some people just throw their crops away, they cannot find a market, but other people are switching to producing for the local market in the hill. Some prices are increasing, so it means they're able to get back some of their investment. So this is a very variable issue, but I think the point here is that villagers should be careful to over specialize, but they should spread risks and also look for what to do if the road goes, you know, to have a more resilient livelihood model. So that sometimes needs NGOs to support, you know, diversity. Okay, and one other point I should mention here lastly is that there's competition for water. So this fellow is irrigating his crop, but he's using community water and he has to negotiate. Okay, so just to summarize, in my experience, we've got increasing impacts of climate change, and I've just been illustrating with some examples, and it's the It's the job of researchers and NGOs and government to try and help communities facing impacts of climate change to adapt. And some adaptations can be advantageous, but it depends on working with communities to understand what is their situation, how their livelihoods are already changing, and what are their pathways to get onto. Okay, I could go on, but I better stop because I take up so much time. Okay, thanks very much. I hope that was helpful.
So, hi, my name is Miram Asari. I am studying climate change and development at UEA. So if you guys have any question, you can go ahead. Or maybe I will start. Then you can also prepare questions. So my question is about the cutting the carbon emission. Like for example, in COP27, the Ethiopian government, they said that they are not going to cut any carbon emission until they reach the level of the development of the like UK and US and those countries. So how you relate cutting the carbon emission with the climate and social justice?
Yeah, okay, that's a very important point. Climate justice, it means let's try and achieve a fairness. It's imperative that emissions stop immediately because every emission contributes additional increase in temperature. And already we are seeing catastrophic climate change impacts in different parts of the world, and they are going to get worse. And what will it will directly affect global food security. It's already affecting global food security. You can see prices of food are going up. So it's imperative to stop. Now, how to distribute the culpability for causing current climate change is one issue, and then what to do where we are now about climate emissions driving climate change in the future. So it's a difficult negotiation because no one wants to abandon their own advantage. Whether wealthy countries that have made a lot of money through industrialization using carbon, countries that are currently industrializing and are using a lot of carbon, and countries that have not industrialized and would like to industrialize in order to improve living standard and economic opportunity. So I think the challenge is finding a zero carbon pathway to development. And petrochemical and coal we must stop using it, but we don't have any alternative that is as good as petrochemical. So it's a very difficult problem. I think it cannot be resolved, and I don't expect it to be resolved. I just expect catastrophe. I mean, I'm sad to say that, but I think all we can do is help people cope with these almost intractable problems. I try to not use petrochemical. I stop driving my car. I try to minimize flying. I hate flying. I feel like it's a crime to fly. So I might fly once a year for my university on business, but I detest it and I don't like to do it at all. And I think we all have to just stop using petrochemical. The companies will keep selling petrochemical as long as we are using it.
So do you think it's only petrochemical?
Well, the fossil fuel and land use change.
What about livestock and people who are eating?
Okay, so I think there's, okay, we're all eating. There are two sorts of greenhouse gas. There are lithosphere carbon, that is fossil fuel, and there's biosphere carbon, that's the fast cycling in the biosphere, trees, methane from livestock, etc. So I think the biosphere carbon is less of a problem, although it's a disaster when forests are cleared, high carbon density forests are cleared. Fossil fuel carbon is the problem, so we must stop that.
Okay.
I mean, I think it's unethical to consume fossil fuel, except in a very low amount. And, the problem actually is the rich middle class people in all societies of the world, that I bet the carbon footprint in Addis from wealthy people is not so different from the carbon footprint of wealthy people in London. It's the people who are participating in a high energy lifestyle that are driving climate change, and the industries that are supporting that.
So do you think people in the wealthy country, they are already aware about climate change catastrophe and they are already taking some steps in order to face this issue, or they don't feel it yet?
So only a small number of people in developed countries conscientious enough to try and cut, you know, to make to cut the majority of their greenhouse gas emissions. We have several keen activists in this university, in our department, and some people are trying to block roads and block oil refineries and block oil supply, and they are imprisoned, and most people criticize them. Stop disrupting our normal life. But increasing number of people feel like we better act, we better do something to try and disrupt the pattern of fossil fuel use.
Yeah, I think it's like not ethical. We try to understand, like people who are eating meat, this like culture, like it's a culture already, and if we come and force them to stop this kind of behavior, I think it is morally not acceptable.
I think there's a spectrum of what is ethical and what is not ethical. I think the very unethical thing is high energy lifestyle. And that means lots of fossil fuel use for many international flights. So there's things that people don't have to do, but they choose to do. But there are things that people find it very difficult not to do. You know, so if you have family on Canada and you're living in somewhere and you have to visit them, it's very difficult not to visit your family. But less visit is favorable, and until we find some other way for international travel which is very low carbon, you know, it may be difficult. But be aware, every kilo of carbon that is emitted is accelerating catastrophic climate change.
Okay.
There are many hands.
Yeah. Ahmed, you can go ahead. Ahmed Modras, probably.
So Tasneem is asking about green water and basin health.
Yeah.
Should I respond to that question?
Yeah, you can.
So yeah, thanks. Is it Tasneem? Thanks. Okay, my initial idea was to talk about green water and basin health, but I wanted to get a better understanding of the Nile situation before I talk about it. So I include a little bit of reference, but I think if I'm welcome to give another talk, I will give another talk in detail on green water and basin health. But I wanted to talk a bit more broadly today. Yeah, it looks like interview because we have to get questions from community. Thank you, Tasneem, for your understanding.
Yeah.
Hello, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Sadiq Musa Ahmed, Multimedia University, Malaysia. Thank you very much indeed for your very thoughtful lecture. Actually, in your talk, you concentrate more about the people awareness. People awareness actually should be brought by the government policies, environmental policies, to make the people aware. But the problem is there is a disagreement even between the major polluted countries. If you see the World Trade Organization rounds, mostly fail because of the rich countries and most polluted countries. They don't want to commit to abate the pollutions. And also the rich countries in Europe and Japan and America, they want to subsidize their farmers. Yeah, so I think is the issue should be tackled within global manner, through implementing the environmental laws and agreement, and also every country must has environmental policies, and then the implementation is very important to cut the emissions. Regarding the people awareness, definitely is going to, people should be also educated how to reduce their pollutant emissions also. We have a problem now. Most of the countries, they are following the traditional method of development. Pollute now and clean up later. Yeah. They pollute now and they want to clean up later, and I don't know how to when is later, we don't know.
Yeah, there may not be a later. There will not be a
Yeah,
later if we carry on.
Yeah, the second thing is it can be a technological solution. We can go through the green productivity or green technological progress using green technology that the environmental friendly. So we can use the integration of innovation and environmental change or climate change. So we need to integrate the innovation with the environmental policies so we can make the difference.
Yeah,
but this should be supported by the government organization, United Nations, all the countries should do so. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. I agree. Let me just respond. I think firstly, the awareness raising, we cannot rely on governments in any country. Governments are a mix of different people, and there are some very well-intentioned, conscientious people, and there are many people who just want to drift. They just want to do what they must and nothing more. And the governments are under very heavy lobbying pressure from commercial interest who want more advantage. So in Britain, the government say we will be leading climate reformer, and also they're opening coal mine. So it's inconsistent. So I don't expect very much from government, although I nag them and lobby them. But I think we have to rely on civil society group and journalists to raise awareness, and educators, education system. But government should do it, but I don't expect them to do it. Okay. And the other point, I agree with you, we need to already be finding the pathway to sustainable development and not going for fossil fuel intensive development. We have to find the other pathway. And that is a learning process. And it also depends on civil society groups to be like leaders with technologists, with university, with media, to share innovations that are on more resilient, lower carbon pathway. Ahmed, Assam, and Salma had their hand up for a while. Can we respond, or should I just choose and respond? You tell me which one. You must be chair.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi. Nice to having you. Actually, my question is about, maybe it's imaginary question, but how much it take to life to end up in the earth? For example, if we continue doing the same high energy lifestyle, consuming the same amount of energy, I just want to know when the life is going to end up on the earth.
When it will end, we don't know. There are so many uncertainties. So I think this is the issue about tipping point. That at the moment, the Earth has been in a fairly stable climatic state for about 10,000 years. That's the Holocene. We are in an interglacial period. Most of the 5 billion years of Earth, there has been a glaciation period. It's much colder, apart from around the equator. So now we're in a warmer period, but we don't know what will happen if we destabilize the Holocene interglacial climate, global climate. What will happen? It's probable with more carbon, it will become very much hotter. We don't know when that will happen, how that will happen, but we are seeing signs of instability in the, not just in like a warmer year, but the whole system, as I showed with the diagram of tipping point, the melting of glacier, the ocean current becoming unstable, the emission of methane from the tundra, the drying of the Amazon. I hope it answers your question. I think we have to do everything we can now. It's not inevitable, but we have to do everything we can now to avert it. It would be, we won't be blamed for not doing enough.
Okay. Thank you, Selma. We
Thank
have
you.
also Isam. Isam, hi. Okay, you can go ahead, Isam, please.
Hello, good afternoon, good evening, where you are. Isam Adam.
Good afternoon, good afternoon.
From Somaliland here. I studied actually environmental science in Iran University. So I just want to emphasize a little bit about environmental and climate treaties. People, organizations, and government have agreed upon many treaties, although there is no, I can say, application to that. And in terms also of carbon marketing, some, I can say, conventional countries, they sell their ratios to the developed ones, and beyond that, they're having that money in order for them to enhance their situation to build up the infrastructure. But I don't think which sector is supposed to monitor that and to make sure that every country that after receive the money or the budget from non-governmental organizations or IPCC, whatever the institution is, to put that out. Because we can say in countries like Sudan, some areas that affected with flooding and during during rainy seasons, after 2 or 3 months, people are suffering, having more than 5-6 hours in order to bring water from some valleys away from them. It's just problem, and there's no, I can say, technological solutions for trying and harvesting that water. Then they can use it on summer after rain season. So it's just a problem. Another point also in terms of subsidizing these countries, we can say if there's solutions like building institutions for research, for example, in Sudan, the most 2 factors that we affected with it, and it's very obvious for everyone, is raising the temperature. I think the highest degree was recorded 49 or 48 degrees Celsius 2 years ago. Although there's no accurate measurement, there's no accurate institutions that we can trust to build up our database, and then we can say a climatic opinion about that. The same thing with the flooding, how students can measure, researchers can measure. So if there's that subsidized is being, like I can say, founded to initiate research institution will be very good. Thank you so much for having
thanks so much. Thanks so much for your point. Just on your point about treaties, many national governments are not very good at implementing treaty commitments. So I don't know, in some countries it's impossible to lobby government. Government are dictatorship. In other countries it's more possible. But it's, it depends on the national level polity. Many governments sign easily and, ignore the commitment. This is a widespread problem. On the carbon marketing, most of this is not very realistic. There's a money game which is separate from the real carbon sequestration game. But there are some small initiatives where small amounts of carbon money go to farmers. So I work with one of those initiatives called Plan Vivo, and we do very small detailed project, particularly for agroforestry, for paying for tree planting. So it could be we could experiment in future in Sudan. I don't know what is the possibility in Sudan, but I think that would be interesting to explore. Can I just suggest we catch, there was one gentleman who tried to formulate a question, Ahmed Mordos. Can we go to Ahmed? I wouldn't like to miss.
But we give him a chance though.
Well, let's give him another chance.
I can't hide him.
Ahmed, you want to come on the Ahmed Mordos? You want to come on the microphone? We wouldn't like you to go away dissatisfied.
Okay, if you can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you. Thank you. Thank you. Sorry.
So much, very many thanks for you, Oliver, for the good presentation. That.
Thank you for your interest.
Yeah, really. I'm really very interested in climate change. I'm a specialist in climate change and adaptations. My question is, you talk about the increased impact of climate change to adaptation with community development. I'm really interested and work on this for advisory for climate change. In countries that are really impacted by, and they have risk hot spots by farming, drought, and flooding, and that is one of the impact of climate change, like Sudan, Darfur, Somalia, and all these African Saharan country. What do you think? I just need, if you can give us just a point for how best we can do adaptation, resilience, and community development for those actually people are immediate need for that development in terms of.
Okay, great. I think that this is one of the most important challenges, and I don't think there's any simple answer that, you know, just do this or just do that. I think the question is more, what is the process to support? So the way that I tend to do research work is working with community, like co-learning, exchanging learning over time. So I could imagine the sort of work I was doing in Myanmar, we would have partner community and we work with them, we help them to formulate like a plan, identify what are the constraints, what are the opportunity, and then try to implement the plan, and then revisit it every year for a few years and have exchange between communities. So that is what we would call action research or a participatory research model. So I would favor something like this, that we identify a group of community that can be leading with, particularly with very dynamic individual, like community leader are very conscientious, or, you know, some leading farmer or leading trader. And then work with them over the years for them to identify and then transfer learning and exchange. You know, do you want to experiment with water harvesting technology, or with, you know, river electrification scheme, something like this, or hard infrastructure like flood defense, and learn over time, and then they can be pioneers of innovation, which could then be scaled out to neighboring community. So I would focus on the process, like a co-learning process, and then try and implement, maybe get small grant to do that over time. And that it can be community-based organization are the best to do that, because you have the rapport with the community. It depends on trust. Anyone to invest time.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Oliver. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, very clearly.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Oliver, for the very informative and absolutely fruitful session. The presentation, the graphics, the elaboration was very thorough. I, Shayma, and the rest of the EcoNile team, we thank you very much for your precious time. And we certainly hope that this isn't the last collaboration between us. We look forward to many more sessions presented by you. And we'd like to take this chance to thank Dr. Abdin Saleh, who is considered the father of water in Sudan and one of the experts in the world, for attending with us today and for his continuous support for youth organizations and for EcoNile. Dr. Abdin, would you like to comment?
First of all, I would like to thank Professor Oliver for an excellent presentation. And when I put my hand up, I wanted to suggest to you and to Shihab and to the team, who are doing a wonderful job. But I hope this excellent lecture and this excellent information should not end with 54 participants. I think it needs to be distributed. So I suggest that you take his permission to make a video of this thing and to be distributed at different target level. And we may help in that in the center, in the University of Khartoum or elsewhere, and to reach even our decision makers. Because in Sudan, I think sometimes they feel that the awareness itself about climate change and its effect, which is starting to appear very clearly nowadays, is there. Secondly, we don't have the enough support on producing knowledge through research. We tried in our center to start a section on climate change, and it's not only water, as Professor Oliver showed, that it is a work, it's a multidisciplinary team and work. And again, we have to reach, of course, the communities. I mean, the communities which, and this also needs the excellent work which the young children they did in this water parliament. I think they did a wonderful job, and they can help in a lot of things, not only really the awareness part, but they can help in a lot of things if they work with the research centers, and I should try to bring this also information to many target groups, including the decision maker. I take this opportunity really to tell you, Dr. Professor Oliver, that I learned a lot from your presentation.
I'm very surprised.
And also, I'd like also to thank Shihab and his colleagues for inviting me to be there in here. And I think it should be a start for an additional work for you, those our young, effective and producing young members of the water parliament, and this is great. Thank you very much.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen.
Hello, yes.
Thanks, Dr. Oliver, about this useful session. I'm Shihab Ad-Din, the Secretary General of EcoNile organization. I would like to thank all my team for this outstanding job about to success this session. And also I would like to thank Professor Abdin Saleh, one of the expertise in water and climate change in Sudan. And he also support us as the young and youth organization in Sudan. I would like to ask you about to share this presentation and video, and we need to more collaboration in the upcoming future to make use of it, especially in Sudan and in all Africa. Finally, I would like to thank Miram for organizing this session, and Yasir and Rayan and all the EcoNile Academy staff. Thank you, and that's all.
Thanks so much. I'd be very happy to participate in future. Let us talk separately about possible future collaboration, different ideas.
Yeah. We can do that. We can respond to this too.
Okay. We want to, what are the, can you summarize for me? I can see, please share the thing.
There is a question about
Connecting, could you share presentation? Okay, I will email. How should I share presentation? Email to the organizer, or you will share? I will email. Okay, I can give transfer.
but I have some questions.
Which other question? That is the last one. There is another session. Basin and climate change can affect organism life. Yeah, I mean, with climate change, biodiversity, aquatic diversity will be affected. That's right. Basin health. I think let's have another session on basin health. Give me a few weeks. Okay. I am optimistic about fusion. No, I'm not optimistic at all. I think that it will be more energy, more what we would call social metabolism. It will just be more processing of resources. So I'm not optimistic until human society is better governed. Of methane, main source of methane, there are two. Decomposition, particularly from ocean and forest areas, and from livestock. And with increase of livestock, also from paddy field, from rice cultivation. So with increase in paddy field and particularly livestock, as more methane needs to be reduced. Okay, shall we conclude? I have a feeling like, all right, thanks so much, really a pleasure. And I'll be very happy to give more. It's very easy for me to give discussion. So I'll be very happy to give, and we should think about research project together. I'll be very happy to collaborate depending on your priorities. Okay, I think we should conclude.
Yeah.
All right, thanks, and hope to see you again soon. All the best. Bye.
Thank you, Dr. Oliver. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
See you. Bye.
Okay. Goodbye.